The Russia-Ukraine war is one of the most defining and consequential conflicts of the 21st century, not only because of the scale of violence and destruction witnessed on European soil, but because it fundamentally challenges the assumptions that shaped Western security thinking after the Cold War, as its origins lie deep in the unresolved political, historical, and psychological aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, when Ukraine emerged as an independent state but inherited fragile institutions, economic dependency, and a strategic position caught between a resurgent Russia and a Western-led international order that believed large-scale war in Europe had become unlikely, if not impossible, a belief widely shared across the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and the European Union, even as Russia struggled to redefine its identity after the loss of empire and increasingly framed NATO expansion and European integration as existential threats rather than voluntary choices made by sovereign nations, creating a long-term clash of worldviews in which Ukraine became the central fault line, particularly as successive Ukrainian governments sought closer political, economic, and security ties with Europe while large segments of the population viewed democratic reform and Western integration as pathways toward stability, prosperity, and independence from Moscow's influence, a trajectory that Russia interpreted not merely as geopolitical competition but as a direct challenge to its historical narrative, security doctrine, and great power status, leading to years of pressure through energy leverage, political interference, and information warfare that escalated dramatically in 2014 following Ukraine's Maidan uprising, when mass protests against corruption and authoritarianism culminated in the removal of a pro-Russian president, prompting Moscow to seize Crimea in a rapid, largely unopposed operation that violated international law and marked the first forcible change of European borders since World War II, while simultaneously fueling armed separatism in eastern Ukraine's Donbass region, where a low-intensity but deadly conflict claimed thousands of lives and served as a warning that the post-Cold War order was far more fragile than Western policymakers had assumed. Yet despite diplomatic efforts, ceasefire agreements, and limited sanctions, the underlying conflict remained unresolved, creating a frozen war that allowed Russia to test Western resolve while Ukraine continued military reforms, strengthened civil society, and deepened cooperation with NATO partners, setting the stage for a far more dramatic escalation when in February 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine under the belief that rapid military force would overwhelm Ukrainian resistance, fracture Western unity, and restore Moscow's dominance over what it considered its rightful sphere of influence, an assumption that proved catastrophically flawed as Ukrainian forces, motivated by national survival and supported by unprecedented levels of Western intelligence sharing, defensive weaponry, and diplomatic backing, halted the initial assault on Kyiv, exposed serious weaknesses in Russian logistics and command structures, and transformed the conflict into a prolonged war of attrition defined by trench warfare, massive artillery exchanges, missile and drone strikes, cyber operations, and intense urban combat across multiple fronts. While civilians endured systematic attacks on infrastructure, prolonged blackouts, water shortages, displacement, and psychological trauma on a scale unseen in Europe for generations, triggering one of the largest refugee crises since the 1940s and forcing neighboring countries and transatlantic allies to confront the reality that modern warfare, even when geographically contained, produces global consequences as energy prices surged, supply chains fractured, food insecurity intensified, and political debates within NATO and the European Union shifted from abstract deterrence to urgent questions of military readiness, defense spending, and long-term strategic commitment, illustrating that the Russia-Ukraine war is not merely a regional conflict but the opening chapter of a broader struggle over power, sovereignty, and the rules governing international behavior in an increasingly unstable world. As the initial phase of the full-scale invasion failed to deliver the rapid collapse Moscow had anticipated, the Russia-Ukraine war entered a far more dangerous and complex stage in which both sides adapted their strategies while the conflict increasingly resembled the large-scale, industrial warfare that Western military planners had long studied but hoped never to see return to Europe, as Russian forces shifted their focus away from a swift decapitation strike toward Kyiv and instead concentrated on consolidating territorial gains in eastern and southern Ukraine, particularly in the Donbass region and along the land corridor linking Russia to Crimea, transforming vast areas into entrenched battlefields defined by defensive lines, layered minefields, fortified positions, and relentless artillery duels that consumed ammunition at rates unseen since the mid-20th century, while Ukraine, facing a numerically larger adversary, relied on mobility, intelligence-driven targeting, and precision strikes enabled by Western-supplied systems to blunt Russian advances and impose heavy costs, demonstrating to audiences in Washington, London, Ottawa, and across Europe that modern warfare is no longer dominated solely by mass formations but by the integration of satellite intelligence, real-time surveillance, and decentralized command structures. Even as the human toll of the conflict continued to rise steadily, with cities such as Mariupol becoming symbols of total Destruction after weeks of siege warfare reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble and trapped civilians without food, water, or medical care, reinforcing comparisons to some of the darkest chapters of 20th century European history and forcing Western governments to confront not only strategic questions but urgent moral ones, as images of civilian suffering circulated globally and eroded any remaining illusions that the war could be contained or resolved quickly through limited concessions. While the discovery of mass graves and evidence of executions in liberated areas intensified international condemnation and strengthened calls for accountability, further hardening positions on both sides and reducing the political space for compromise, as Russia increasingly framed the conflict as an existential struggle against Western encirclement while Ukraine articulated the war as a fight for national survival and democratic choice, narratives that resonated deeply with Western publics, who viewed the invasion as a direct challenge to the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity that underpin the post-World War II international order, leading NATO and EU members to accelerate military assistance and expand sanctions regimes targeting Russian banking, technology imports, and energy exports, even as European societies grappled with rising energy prices, inflation, and political polarization at home, illustrating how the consequences of modern conflict radiate outward to affect civilian life far beyond the battlefield. While within Ukraine the war reshaped everyday existence as air raid sirens, blackouts, and mobilization became part of daily routine, blurring the line between front lines and rear areas and reinforcing the reality that contemporary wars are fought across entire societies rather than isolated military zones, a development that Western analysts increasingly recognized as a defining feature of 21st century conflict, especially as cyber operations, disinformation campaigns, and economic pressure complemented kinetic military action, creating a multi-domain struggle in which victory could not be measured solely by territory gained or lost but by resilience, international support, and the ability to sustain prolonged resistance, as Ukraine's continued defiance undermined assumptions about Russian military dominance and prompted a broader reassessment within NATO of defense readiness, stockpile capacity, and the long-term sustainability of deterrence, while simultaneously revealing the limits of military power when confronted by a determined population supported by global alliances, setting the stage for a protracted war whose outcome would depend not only on battlefield performance but on political will, economic endurance, and the evolving strategic calculations of actors far beyond Eastern Europe. As the war settled into a prolonged phase of attrition, the Eastern Front, particularly the Donbass region, became the focal point of sustained and grinding combat that reflected both the strategic priorities and limitations of the opposing sides, as Russian forces sought incremental territorial gains through overwhelming artillery fire and manpower while Ukraine aimed to exhaust the attacker through defensive depth, counter-battery fire, and selective counteroffensives, creating a battlefield environment dominated by trench systems, fortified urban ruins, and constant surveillance from drones that left little room for surprise, while Western military observers increasingly compared the fighting to a fusion of First World War-style positional warfare and 21st-century precision targeting, a combination that underscored how technological advancement had not eliminated the brutality of close combat but had instead made it more relentless and transparent, as every movement risked immediate detection and destruction, while Ukraine's dependence on Western-supplied artillery, air defense systems, and later armored vehicles highlighted both the strength and fragility of international support, as supply chains, training timelines, and political approval processes directly influenced battlefield outcomes, even as Russia adapted by dispersing forces, hardening logistics, and increasing domestic arms production under sanctions, revealing the limits of economic pressure in rapidly constraining a state willing to absorb long-term costs, a reality that complicated Western expectations of quick strategic effects and forced policymakers to recalibrate their assumptions about coercion, endurance, and escalation, while the war's informational dimension intensified further as both sides sought to shape international opinion through battlefield narratives, casualty reporting, and symbolic victories, recognizing that sustained foreign support depended not only on military performance but on maintaining political legitimacy and public attention in distant capitals, a challenge that grew more complex as the conflict dragged on and competed with other global crises. Even as for Ukrainian society, the war became an all-encompassing national effort defined by mobilization, sacrifice, and resilience, with civilians contributing through volunteer networks, reconstruction efforts, and civil defense while enduring ongoing missile strikes and economic disruption, reinforcing the perception among Western audiences that Ukraine's resistance was not merely a military campaign but a societal struggle that challenged conventional distinctions between soldiers and civilians in modern warfare. Beyond the immediate battlefield, the Russia-Ukraine war increasingly reshaped the broader strategic environment across Europe and the transatlantic alliance, as NATO underwent its most significant transformation in decades, expanding its forward presence, revising defense plans, and welcoming new members who concluded that neutrality no longer provided security in an era of renewed great power confrontation, a shift that reflected a fundamental reassessment of risk among European states long Accustomed to peace dividends and minimal military spending, while the European Union, traditionally oriented toward economic integration rather than hard security, found itself coordinating sanctions, energy diversification, and defense initiatives at an unprecedented scale, even as internal divisions emerged over burden-sharing, escalation risks, and the long-term sustainability of support for Ukraine, debates closely watched in Washington, London, and Ottawa where leaders sought to balance domestic priorities with international commitments, as the war exposed the interconnected nature of global systems through disruptions to energy markets, grain exports, and industrial supply chains that reverberated far beyond Eastern Europe, contributing to inflation, food insecurity, and political instability in regions with no direct involvement in the conflict, thereby reinforcing the lesson that modern wars generate cascading effects that challenge the ability of governments to compartmentalize foreign and domestic policy. While Russia's increasing reliance on alternative trade partners and non-Western relationships highlighted the emerging fractures in the global order and raised questions about the future effectiveness of sanctions as a primary tool of statecraft, prompting Western analysts to reconsider how economic power can be wielded in a more fragmented and competitive international system, even as the war's moral dimension remains central to public discourse. With investigations into alleged war crimes, civilian targeting, and forced displacement reinforcing the perception that the conflict represented a direct assault on the norms established to prevent the horrors of the 20th century from repeating, thereby elevating the stakes of the war beyond Ukraine itself and framing it as a test of whether international law and collective security mechanisms retain real meaning in practice. As the conflict continued without a decisive resolution, the Russia-Ukraine war increasingly came to be understood in Western societies not as a temporary crisis but as a structural shift in the international system, one that signaled the end of assumptions about inevitable globalization, cooperative security, and the declining relevance of military force as policymakers, military planners, and civilians alike confronted the reality that the post-Cold War era had given way to a more contested and unstable world in which power politics, territorial disputes, and ideological competition had returned to the center of global affairs, forcing democracies to grapple with difficult questions about defense spending, industrial capacity, alliance cohesion, and the balance between deterrence and diplomacy, while Ukraine's continued resistance underscored the enduring importance of national identity, leadership, and societal resilience in shaping the outcome of war, even against a larger adversary, offering lessons that resonated deeply with audiences in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Europe about the limits of military power, the value of international solidarity, and the human cost of strategic failure, as the war demonstrated that while technology, sanctions, and alliances can influence the trajectory of conflict, they cannot eliminate the suffering inherent in war, or guarantee quick solutions, leaving a growing recognition that the ultimate resolution of the Russia-Ukraine war would likely emerge not from a single battlefield victory but from a complex interplay of military endurance, political negotiation, economic pressure, and societal will, a process that would shape European security, transatlantic relations, and global norms for years to come and serve as a defining lesson for future generations about the consequences of unresolved grievances, miscalculation, and the fragile nature of peace in a world where history has not ended but continues to assert itself with devastating force. As the war moved deeper into its second year, the question confronting Western governments and analysts was no longer whether Ukraine could survive, but whether the international coalition supporting it could sustain the political, economic, and military commitment required for a prolonged confrontation, as the conflict increasingly resembled a test of endurance rather than maneuver, with both sides absorbing heavy losses while seeking to exhaust the other's resources and will, a dynamic that placed immense pressure on Ukraine's population and infrastructure while simultaneously straining Western stockpiles of ammunition, air defense systems, and armored vehicles, forcing a reassessment of defense industrial capacity across NATO countries that had long prioritized efficiency over resilience, as policymakers recognized that modern high-intensity warfare consumes material at a pace incompatible with peacetime production models, even as Russia demonstrated its own capacity to adapt. Under sanctions by mobilizing additional manpower, expanding arms production, and redirecting trade toward non-Western partners, complicating expectations that economic pressure alone would decisively alter Moscow's calculus, while the battlefield itself continued to evolve through the widespread use of drones for reconnaissance and strike missions, electronic warfare to disrupt communications and navigation, and increasingly sophisticated air defense networks that contested control of the skies, reinforcing to Western audiences that the war in Ukraine was shaping the future character of warfare and providing hard lessons that would influence military planning for decades, even as the human dimension remained central, with Ukrainian society sustaining extraordinary levels of sacrifice through mobilization, displacement, and loss, underscoring that resilience in modern conflict is as much social and political as it is military. Parallel to the military struggle, the diplomatic battlefield intensified as governments sought to manage escalation risks while maintaining pressure on Russia, navigating a narrow path between deterrence and direct confrontation that required constant coordination among allies with differing threat perceptions, domestic political constraints, and historical experiences. As the United States assumed a central role in organizing military assistance and intelligence support while encouraging European allies to take greater responsibility for regional security, a shift that reflected both strategic necessity and broader debates about burden sharing within NATO, while countries such as the United Kingdom and Canada emphasized long-term support for Ukraine as a matter of principle tied to the defense of international law. Even as divisions occasionally surfaced within Europe over the pace and scope of assistance, energy policy, and the prospects for negotiation, highlighting the inherent difficulty of sustaining unity over time in the face of economic hardship and war fatigue. While Russia sought to exploit these tensions through diplomatic outreach, information campaigns, and selective escalation, including rhetoric surrounding nuclear deterrence, aimed at shaping Western decision-making and constraining support for Ukraine, a strategy that underscored the psychological dimension of modern conflict and reinforced the importance of credibility, signaling, and alliance cohesion in preventing miscalculation. Within Ukraine, the war continued to transform governance, economy, and national identity, as emergency measures reshaped state institutions, redirected resources toward defense, and accelerated integration with Western political and security structures, reinforcing the sense that Ukraine's future was increasingly bound to Europe despite the immense costs of war. While local administrations and civil society organizations played a critical role in sustaining basic services, humanitarian relief, and reconstruction even under constant threat, demonstrating a level of societal mobilization that challenged traditional assumptions about state capacity under fire. As education shifted online or underground, healthcare systems adapted to mass casualty events, and communities organized to support displaced populations, offering Western observers a powerful illustration of how modern societies adapt to prolonged conflict, even as the long-term consequences of war, trauma, demographic change, economic disruption, began to loom larger, raising questions about post-war recovery, accountability, and reconciliation that would shape Ukraine's trajectory long after the fighting ceased, regardless of the precise territorial outcome. Globally, the Russia-Ukraine war accelerated broader trends toward geopolitical fragmentation, as states outside the transatlantic alliance weighed their own interests amid competing narratives and economic pressures, revealing the limits of Western influence in a multipolar world where many governments prioritize strategic autonomy over alignment. Even as the conflict's impact on food and energy markets disproportionately affected vulnerable populations in regions far removed from Europe, complicating Western efforts to frame the war as a universal struggle between democracy and authoritarianism, while underscoring the need for a more inclusive approach to global diplomacy that addressed the concerns of the global South, a reality that Western policymakers increasingly acknowledged as they sought to maintain international support for sanctions and diplomatic initiatives, recognizing that the legitimacy of the international order depends not only on power but on perceived fairness and responsiveness to shared challenges. By this stage, the Russia-Ukraine war had come to symbolize a broader reckoning with the assumptions that defined the early 21st century, forcing societies in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Europe to confront uncomfortable truths about vulnerability, preparedness, and the costs of complacency. As the conflict demonstrated that peace is not a permanent condition but a fragile achievement requiring constant effort, credible deterrence, and a willingness to defend shared values, while Ukraine's continued resistance highlighted the enduring power of national identity and collective purpose in shaping history, even as the war's unresolved nature left open fundamental questions about the future of European security, the role of alliances, and the prospects for a stable international order, ensuring that the lessons of Ukraine would reverberate far beyond its borders and long after the final shots are fired, serving as a stark reminder that the choices made during this conflict will influence global politics, security, and human lives for generations to come. From the point where the war became an accepted reality rather than a temporary emergency, Western governments increasingly shifted their focus from short-term crisis management to long-term strategic adaptation, recognizing that the Russia-Ukraine war had permanently altered Europe's security environment and required sustained policy responses rather than reactive measures. As defense budgets across NATO countries rose sharply, conscription debates resurfaced in several European states, and military planners revisited doctrines that had been shaped by decades of counterinsurgency rather than large-scale conventional war, while Ukraine's battlefield experience began to influence Western training programs, force structure decisions, and procurement priorities, underscoring how real-world combat feedback was reshaping military thinking faster than academic theory ever could. Even as the war continued to impose severe strain on Ukraine's economy, infrastructure, and population, forcing difficult trade-offs between immediate survival and long-term development, a dilemma that resonated with Western audiences who increasingly understood that supporting Ukraine meant committing not just weapons but sustained financial assistance, reconstruction planning, and political backing over many years. At the same time, The war intensified debates about escalation and restraint, particularly regarding advanced weapon systems, long-range strike capabilities, and the potential expansion of the conflict beyond Ukraine's borders, as policymakers in Washington, London, Ottawa, and European capitals weighed the imperative of enabling Ukraine to defend itself effectively against the risk of provoking wider confrontation, a balance that required constant recalibration as battlefield conditions evolved and political pressures shifted, while Russia's repeated references to nuclear deterrence, though widely interpreted as signaling rather than imminent intent, nevertheless underscored the gravity of the conflict and the stakes involved, reinforcing the reality that modern great power wars unfold under the shadow of catastrophic escalation. Even as Ukraine sought to reassure its partners that its objectives remained focused on restoring sovereignty rather than pursuing broader regional confrontation, highlighting the complex interplay between military necessity, political signaling, and alliance management that defined this stage of the war. Within Russia, the prolonged nature of the conflict gradually reshaped domestic politics, economic priorities, and societal expectations as the state mobilized resources, tightened control over information, and framed the war as a defensive struggle against external hostility, while the cumulative effects of sanctions, casualties, and isolation began to alter everyday life in subtle but significant ways, a dimension often overlooked in battlefield-centric analysis but essential for understanding the war's long-term trajectory, as Western analysts increasingly recognized that the outcome of the conflict would be influenced not only by events in Ukraine but by internal dynamics within Russia itself, including elite cohesion, public tolerance for loss, and the regime's ability to sustain legitimacy under pressure, factors that historically have played decisive roles in the resolution of prolonged wars. Meanwhile, the humanitarian consequences of the conflict continued to deepen, as millions of Ukrainians remained displaced internally or abroad, reshaping demographics, labor markets, and social structures across Europe, while host countries grappled with integration challenges alongside expressions of solidarity, revealing both the strengths and limits of European unity in the face of prolonged crisis, even as international organizations struggled to maintain access and deliver aid amid ongoing hostilities, highlighting the persistent vulnerability of civilians in modern warfare despite decades of legal frameworks designed to protect them, a reality that reinforced the moral urgency of the conflict for Western publics and sustained pressure on governments to pursue accountability mechanisms, war crimes investigations, and post-conflict justice as integral components of any eventual resolution. As discussions about Ukraine's post-war future gained prominence, questions of reconstruction, security guarantees, and integration into European and transatlantic institutions became central to strategic planning, as Western leaders increasingly acknowledged that rebuilding Ukraine would require resources and coordination on a scale comparable to historic post-war recovery efforts, while simultaneously ensuring that any settlement did not leave Ukraine vulnerable to renewed aggression. A challenge that underscored the interconnected nature of military outcomes and political arrangements, and reinforced the lesson that wars do not truly end when fighting stops but continue to shape societies through the conditions imposed at their conclusion, a perspective deeply informed by Europe's own 20th century history and increasingly reflected in Western policy debates. On the global stage, the war's ripple effects continued to influence international alignments, accelerating trends toward strategic competition, regionalization, and selective cooperation, as states reassessed their dependencies, diversified trade relationships, and reconsidered assumptions about stability, while institutions designed to manage collective security faced renewed scrutiny regarding their effectiveness and adaptability, prompting discussions about reform, legitimacy, and representation that extended far beyond the immediate context of Ukraine, reinforcing the understanding that the Russia-Ukraine war was not an isolated crisis but part of a broader transition toward a more fragmented and contested international system. For Ukraine itself, the war became a defining chapter in national identity, shaping collective memory, political culture, and societal values in ways that would endure long after the conflict's end, as sacrifice, resilience, and resistance became central narratives, while the experience of widespread destruction and loss underscored the profound cost of sovereignty denied, offering a powerful reminder to Western audiences that abstract principles such as territorial integrity and international law acquire meaning only through the lived experiences of those forced to defend them, a realization that strengthened public support for Ukraine even amid fatigue and competing global concerns. In retrospect, the Russia-Ukraine war increasingly appeared as a turning point that exposed the limits of post-Cold War optimism and forced a reassessment of how peace is maintained in a world where power, identity, and security remain deeply contested, as the conflict demonstrated that neglecting unresolved tensions does not eliminate them but allows them to fester until they erupt with devastating force, a lesson that resonated across Western societies and informed debates about prevention, early warning, and the responsibilities of international leadership in addressing emerging crises before they escalate into full-scale war. Ultimately, the full story of the Russia-Ukraine war, from its historical roots to its global consequences, delivers a clear and enduring moral for audiences in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Europe. That peace is not sustained by wishful thinking or economic interdependence alone, but by vigilance, unity, credible deterrence, and a commitment to uphold international law even when doing so carries significant cost, as the war reveals that the true price of conflict is paid not only in territory or strategic position but in human lives, shattered communities, and generations shaped by violence, while also demonstrating that collective resolve, international solidarity, and societal resilience can alter the course of history, making the legacy of Ukraine's struggle not merely a chronicle of destruction but a warning and a lesson for the future. That defending sovereignty, protecting civilians, and addressing grievances before they turn violent remain essential if the world is to avoid repeating the same tragic cycle on an even greater scale.